Show me how to milk cows. That's what she said, standing in the cold dawn of his empty barn. He was the giant cowboy folks whispered about, the one who hadn't touched a woman since the day he buried his young bride. She was a dust-worn widow with nothing left but a deed in her pocket and a will strong enough to face the winter alone. He thought he was just teaching her to grip a pail and calm a stubborn cow. But in a land where creek means life, someone else wanted her gone, and would use the law, the snow, and even theft to do it. The wind carries more than snow this winter. It carries secrets. Papers gone missing. A banker's smile that hides a knife, and a past the cowboy swore he'd never reopen. When the barn lanterns burn low and the hoofbeats come in the night, will he stand aside and let her be driven out, or stand between her and the man who'd take everything? Every story I share leads with love. For people, for healing, for the things we sometimes forget to say out loud. The October morning air, bit sharp and cold. As Ezra McKenna trudged across the yard toward the barn, his breath came out in white puffs, and the sun had barely started painting the eastern sky in pale pink stripes. The big rancher pulled his sheepskin coat tighter, his weathered face set in its usual stern lines. Just another morning, he thought, reaching for the wooden bar that held the barn door closed. The familiar scent of hay and livestock greeted him as he heaved the door open, but something was different. Instead of the quiet shuffle of his milk cow Blossom, he heard muttered words and the scrape of wood on packed earth. Ezra stopped dead in his tracks. A woman sat perched awkwardly on his milking stool, her dark skirts caked with mud and trailing in the straw. She was wrestling with the stool, trying to get close enough to Blossom while keeping her balance. The cow shifted nervously, and the bucket clattered against the woman's knees. "Land sakes," she muttered, then looked up at Ezra's looming shadow. Her eyes widened, but her chin lifted with determination despite the pallor of her face. The bucket slipped, splashing fresh milk across her mud-stained skirts. "Show me how to milk cows," she said, her voice stronger than her trembling hands suggested. Ezra frowned, his guard up. Strangers meant trouble, especially ones who showed up uninvited in his barn. "Ma'am, this here's private property." "I know." That she stood, smoothing her skirts despite the hopeless state of them. "I'm Clara Lee, and I need to learn about livestock. The sooner the better." "Ain't in the business of teaching folks," Ezra said gruffly, turning away. But something made him pause, maybe the hollow look in her eyes, or the way her shoulders squared against his rejection, even as her hands shook. "Please," she said quietly. "I haven't eaten since yesterday noon." Ezra's shoulders slumped slightly. He might be suspicious of strangers, but he wasn't heartless. "Set yourself back down," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "Grip's all wrong. That's why you're spilling." Relief flickered across her face as she settled back onto the stool. Ezra positioned himself behind her, his large hands demonstrating the proper technique. Thumb and forefinger, up high like this. Then squeeze and pull down smooth. Clara tried to copy his movements, her smaller hands working carefully. Nothing happened. She tried again, and a thin stream of milk finally hit the bucket. She laughed, the sound bright in the dim barn. "Well, would you look at that?" Something in Ezra's chest loosened at that laugh. It had been a long time since anyone had found joy in his barn. "Ain't so hard once you get the feel of it," he allowed, stepping back to watch her progress. 20 minutes later. They sat at his scarred kitchen table, steam rising from 2 tin cups of coffee. Clara had explained about her uncle's homestead west of town, land she'd inherited but needed to work to keep the claim valid. Her husband's long illness had left her with practical skills in short supply. "I can cook, clean, and drive a fare." "Bargain," she said, wrapping her fingers around the warm cup. "But livestock? That's a mystery to me. And without knowing how to manage stock, I'll lose everything." Ezra studied her across the table. The coffee had brought some color back to her cheeks, but worry still lined her eyes. He thought about the cattle shipping season ahead, the long days of work that always stretched his help thin. "Might be we could make a trade," he said slowly. Clara's eyes sharpened with interest. What kind of trade? Shipping season's coming up. Need extra hands. For that, you help out then. I'll teach you what you need to know about running stock. Done, Clara said instantly, extending her hand across the table. Ezra hesitated just a moment before taking it. Her grip was firm despite her earlier trembling, and something about that small show of strength settled his remaining doubts. First, lessons tomorrow at dawn, he said, releasing her hand. Can't learn stock keeping if you can't get here early. I'll be here, Clara promised, standing and straightening her still damp skirts. And Mr. McKenna, thank you. Ezra just nodded, watching as she headed for the door. The morning sun had fully risen now, catching in her dark hair as she stepped outside. He stayed at the table long after she'd gone, thinking about how one muddy woman's determination had somehow cracked through years of careful solitude that it wasn't until he was back in the barn, finishing the morning chores, that he realized. He was actually looking forward to tomorrow's lesson. The thought stopped him cold. Looking forward to things was dangerous. It led to hoping, and hoping led to hurting. But as he worked, he couldn't quite shake the memory of Clara's triumphant laugh when she'd finally gotten the milk to flow. The afternoon sun slanted through Ezra's kitchen windows, warming the worn floorboards as Clara stood at the heavy wooden table, chopping vegetables for beef stew. Her borrowed apron covered her mud-stained dress, and the steady thunk of her knife against the cutting board mixed with the quiet sounds of Ezra, working on leather tack at the far end of the table. Carrots go in first, Clara said, more to herself. Then to Ezra. Then the potatoes so they don't turn to mush. Her mother's lessons came back easily. Even after years of city living during her husband's illness, Ezra merely grunted, his big hands working deftly with an awl to repair a broken bridle strap. The leather creaked as he pulled it taut. The door swung open, letting in a gust of cold air, along with a woman in her mid-30s, her dark hair tucked neatly beneath a practical bonnet. Ezra McKenna, you didn't tell me you had company, she announced, unwrapping her shawl. Maggie, Ezra acknowledged without looking up. Claire Lee. Clara, my sister Maggie. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. McKenna. Just Maggie, the woman corrected, hanging her shawl on a peg. Her sharp eyes took in the scene, the vegetables, the simmering pot, her brother's unusual tolerance of company. Well, now, what brings you? To my brother's kitchen? Clara explained about the milking lesson and the arrangement while she added vegetables to the pot. Maggie listened, her expression growing more concerned with each word. When Clara stepped outside to draw water from the well, Maggie rounded on her brother. Ezra, what are you thinking? Getting tangled up with strangers. You don't know anything about this woman. Ain't getting tangled, Ezra muttered, still focused on his work. Just teaching her what she needs to know. Since when do you teach anyone anything? Maggie pressed. You've turned away folks before who wanted to learn ranching. The door creaked open before Ezra could respond. Clara struggled in with the heavy water bucket, her face flushed from the effort. As she lifted the bucket to pour water into the pot, her sleeve rode up, revealing angry red blisters across her palms. Maggie's expression softened. Land sakes, child, those hands need tending. She crossed to examine Clara's blisters more closely. Haven't done much physical work before, have you? Not like this, Clara admitted. But I'm learning. Wait here. Maggie disappeared into the front room, returning with a pair of leather work gloves. These should help some. They're old, but they'll protect those hands while they toughen up. I couldn't possibly, Clara started. You can and you will, Maggie insisted. Can't milk cows with blistered hands now, can you? The stew simmered as they ate, steam rising from their bowls. Even Ezra managed a gruff, not bad at the taste, which made Clara smile. After supper, Maggie promised to return Sunday for church. Before climbing into her buggy for the drive back to town, the next morning dawned even colder than the day before. Clara arrived just as the first hint of light touched the eastern sky, wearing Maggie's borrowed gloves. Her thin shawl offered little protection against the biting wind. Ezra met her at the barn door, taking in her shivering form with a frown. Without a word, He disappeared into the tack room and returned with a heavy canvas coat. "Here," he said, holding it out. "Can't work if you're frozen stiff." Frozen stiff. Clara hesitated only a moment before sliding her arms into the oversized sleeves. The coat smelled of leather and hay, and its weight settled warm across her shoulders. "Thank you. Stalls need cleaning first," Ezra said, handing her a pitchfork. "Then we'll see the blossoms feed." They worked side by side, Clara learning the rhythm of mucking stalls while Ezra explained about feed rations. "Hay's dear in winter," he said, measuring out Blossom's portion. "Gotta plan careful. Make it last till spring grass comes." "My uncle," Clara began, then stopped, leaning on her pitchfork. "I never even met him. The deed came in the mail months ago, after he passed. I didn't even know he had property out here until then." Ezra paused in his work, studying her. "No other kin nearby?" Clara shook her head. "None. Just me and a piece of paper saying I own land I'd never seen." Something shifted in Ezra's chest, a faint stirring of protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. He pushed it down, covering the feeling with his usual silence. But it remained there like a seed taking root. They finished the morning chores as the sun climbed higher. Clara's movements were slower now, her unused muscles protesting. But she didn't complain. If anything, her determination seemed to grow with each task mastered. Later that morning, they watched Maggie's buggy disappear down the road town, her promise to return for Sunday services hanging in the crisp air. Clara stood wrapped in Ezra's borrowed coat, her face turned toward the distant mountains where her uncle's land waited. Ezra found himself watching her instead of buggy, noting how she squared her shoulders against the wind. Something about her stubborn courage in the face of such odds stirred that same protective feeling he'd tried to ignore earlier. He turned abruptly back to his work, hiding his concern behind his usual gruff manner. But he couldn't quite shake the notion that he'd somehow become responsible for this determined widow's welfare. Whether he meant to or not, 3 days of practice had taught Clara's hands the rhythm of morning chores, though the blisters still stung beneath Maggie's borrowed gloves. The early October sun had barely cleared the horizon when Ezra hitched his team to the wagon for their trip into town. Clara settled onto the hard wooden seat beside him, grateful for the warmth of his spare coat against the morning chill. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they followed the rutted road toward town. Ezra sat straight-backed and silent, the reins held loosely in his weathered hands. Clara watched the landscape roll past, dried prairie grass bending in the wind, scattered patches of early frost glinting in hollows, and dark clouds building on the distant horizon. "Looks like weather coming," she observed, breaking the comfortable silence. Ezra nodded. "Storm front. Might catch us on the ride back." The main street of town gradually came into view, already bustling despite the early hour. Freight wagons lined the street, their drivers shouting to each other as they loaded and unloaded goods. Local ranchers tied their horses at hitching posts, gathering in small groups to discuss cattle prices and winter preparations. Guided the wagon to a stop in front of Jensen's general store. The weathered wooden building stretched 2 stories. Its windows displaying everything from tools to fabric. As Clara descended from the wagon, smoothing her skirts, a well-dressed man approached from the direction of the bank. "McKenna," he called out, his voice carrying across the street. "What brings you to town so early?" Ezra's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ames," he acknowledged with a curt nod. Victor. Ames moved with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to deference. His suit was perfectly pressed, despite the dusty street, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. He turned that calculating gaze on Clara. "And who might this be?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew. "Clara Lee," she answered firmly, meeting his gaze. "Ah, yes, the supposed heir to old Thomas Lee's property." Ames raised his voice slightly, ensuring the growing crowd of onlookers could hear. "I'm afraid there seems to be some confusion about that situation. Mrs. Lee, that so-called deed you're claiming isn't worth the paper it's written on." Clara felt her cheeks flush, but kept her voice steady. My uncle's deed is perfectly legal. Mr. Ames, I have it right here. She patted the document in her coat pocket. A shame, really, Ames continued as if she hadn't spoken. I already have plans drawn up for that parcel. The creek running through it is far too important to leave. He paused deliberately, inexperienced hands. Several bystanders had stopped to watch the exchange. Clara could feel their eyes on her, measuring, judging. She lifted her chin. The deed is valid, Mr. Ames. The land is mine. We'll see about that. Ames's smile turned cold. Good day to you both. He tipped his hat and strode away, leaving whispers in his wake. Ezra's hand settled briefly on Clara's shoulder, steering her toward the store's entrance. The bell above the door jangled as they stepped inside. Morning light filtered through. The dusty windows illuminating shelves stocked with dry goods, tools, and supplies. While Clara examined a display of winter preserves, the store clerk, Tom Jensen, drew Ezra aside. Watch yourself with Ames, he muttered, pretending to check inventory. He's been putting pressure on smallholders all up and down the creek. 3 families sold out last month, alone. Seems he's got plans for damming up the water supply. Ezra's expression darkened. Notice more for sale signs than usual. Ain't all willing sales, if you take my meaning, Jensen replied quietly. Man's got influence with the county clerk, too. Papers have a way of disappearing when it suits him. They completed their purchases in thoughtful silence. Feed for the livestock, some basic supplies Clara needed. The storm clouds were moving closer as they loaded the wagon, bringing with them a sharp drop in temperature. The return journey felt longer, the wagon heavy with their purchases. About halfway back to the ranch, Ezra cleared his throat. Could help you check those court records, he offered, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Make sure everything's proper with the deed. Clara's hands tightened on the edge of the seat. I appreciate that, Mr. McKenna, but I won't be bullied off my land, not by Mr. Ames or anyone else. Ezra glanced at her, noting the determination in her profile. Never said you should be. The wind picked up as they drove on, carrying the first hint of rain. The storm front loomed closer, dark clouds building into towering anvils above the plains. The team of horses sensed the changing weather, their ears flicking nervously as thunder rumbled in the distance. Clara pulled Ezra's borrowed coat tighter around her shoulders, but her spine remained straight, her expression resolute. The morning's confrontation had shaken her more than she cared to admit, but she refused to let it show. Her uncle's land represented more than just property. It was her chance at a fresh start, at building something of her own. She wouldn't let Victor Ames steal that from her, no matter what papers he claimed to have. The ranch buildings came into view just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. The storm that had been threatening all morning was finally breaking. But the real tempest, Claire sensed, was still to come. The cold rain drummed steadily against the ranch house windows as Ezra prepared for his journey to the county seat. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway, watching him button his heavy oilskin coat. The weather matched her mood, gray and uncertain. You don't have to do this, she said softly. Not in this weather. Ezra adjusted his hat, pulling it low against the rain. Records office closes at 5. Best get moving. His tone was matter-of-fact, but his eyes held a glimmer of concern. Through the window, Clara watched him mount his sturdy bay gelding and ride out into the dismal morning. The horses' hooves kicked up mud as they disappeared into the misty distance. Half a day's ride in this weather would be miserable. But Ezra hadn't hesitated to offer. Alone in the quiet house, Clara fought the urge to pace. Instead, she gathered ingredients from the pantry: flour, yeast, salt. Her mother had taught her to bake bread years ago, before illness and caring for her late husband had consumed her days. The familiar motions came back slowly as she mixed, and kneaded the dough dot the kitchen gradually warmed from the wood stove, filling with the earthy smell of rising bread. Clara found herself humming as she worked, an old hymn her mother used to sing. The steady rhythm of kneading helped calm her nerves. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Maggie McKenna stood on the porch, shaking water from her umbrella. Thought you might want company, she said, unwrapping her wet shawl. My, something smells wonderful. Clara wiped flour from her hands. Just trying my hand at bread again. It's been years. Well, the way to survive out here is keeping busy, Maggie said, settling into a kitchen chair. Her expression grew serious. Though, I reckon you should know what folks are saying in town. Clara's hand stilled on the dough. About Mr. Ames? Mr. Ames? Maggie nodded. He's been making quite a show at church socials lately, cozying up to the county commissioner. All talk about progress and development. But Mary Jenkins, she does washing for his housekeeper, says he's been meeting with mining investors. Wants to dam up the creek for their operations. Clara's stomach tightened. The creek was the lifeblood of her uncle's land, of all the small ranches in the area. Without that water, ... That's why he wants my claim invalidated, she said quietly. That, and others, Maggie agreed. 3 families sold out last month alone. Though sold might not be the right word from what I hear. They passed the afternoon together, Maggie sharing more town gossip while helping Clara shape the bread loaves. The rain continued falling, and Clara found herself glancing repeatedly at the window. Searching for signs of Ezra's return. Darkness had fallen by the time hoofbeats sounded in the yard. Clara hurried to the door with a lantern, her heart jumping at the sight of Ezra's drenched figure dismounting in the rain. His clothes were soaked through, despite the oilskin coat. Get in by the fire before you catch your death, she insisted. Taking his wet coat while Maggie poured hot coffee, Ezra's face was grim as he warmed his hands around the coffee cup. Clerk was jumpy as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs, he reported. Said your paperwork was misfiled and needed review. Wouldn't let me see the original records. But that's not legal, surely, Clara protested. Legal enough, if the county commissioner backs him up. Ezra's jaw tightened. Saw Ames's name on deed after deed while I was waiting. He's bought up most of the parcels around your uncle's land. Clara sank into a chair, the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. So that's it then? He wins? Not necessarily, Maggie interjected. Folks in town are starting to whisper about his methods. If we could prove he's tampering with records, ... We'd need evidence, Ezra said. And witnesses willing to speak up. Clara straightened her spine, though weariness showed clearly in her eyes. Meanwhile, I need to learn everything I can about running that ranch. If I can't prove I'm capable of working the land... Ezra nodded. We'll keep at your training. Cattle drives coming up. Good chance to prove yourself to the other ranchers. He paused, studying her face. But we'll work on the legal side too. Quiet-like. I won't give up, Clara said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. This land was my uncle's dream. Now it's mine. Well then, Maggie declared, rising to check the cooling bread loaves. We'd best keep you fed while you fight. Nothing builds strength like fresh bread and good company. The warm, yeasty smell filled the kitchen as Maggie sliced the bread. For a moment, the weight of their troubles lifted as they shared the simple meal together. Outside, the rain continued, falling, but inside the ranch house, a small flame of hope stayed lit, fed by friendship, determination, and the promise of justice yet to come. The 3 of them sat around the kitchen table, planning their next moves while steam rose from their coffee cups. They would need to be careful, gathering evidence without alerting Ames to their investigation. But with Ezra's knowledge of the territory, Maggie's connections in town, and Clara's unwavering resolve, they had a fighting chance. Clara watched the rain streaming down the windows. Remembering her uncle's letter about the beauty of this land, she wouldn't let his dream die here. Not like this. Not without a fight. The autumn day settled into a steady rhythm at the McKenna Ranch. Each morning, Clara rose before dawn, wrapping herself in the borrowed coat before heading to the barn. Blossom, the milk cow, greeted her with suspicious eyes, but Clara's hands grew more confident with each passing day. You're getting better, Ezra observed one crisp morning, leaning against the barn door. She ain't kicked the bucket over in 3 days now. Clara laughed, her breath visible in the cold air. We've come to an understanding, haven't we, Blossom? The cow swished her tail in response, nearly catching Clara across the face. Most days, anyway. After morning chores, Ezra took Clara on long rides around the property, teaching her the skills she'd need for her own ranch. Today they rode along the fence line, tools clinking in their saddlebags. The October sun cast long shadows across the browning grass. Fence posts need checking before winter, Ezra explained, dismounting near a leaning section. Snow and ice can bring down weak spots. He demonstrated how to test each post, showing her the signs of rot and wear. Clara worked. Beside him, her gloved hands, Maggie's gift, gripping the tools with determination. My father used to say, a fence is only as strong as its weakest post, she said, working a loose nail free. Smart man, Ezra replied. He watched as she hammered the nail back in with precise strikes. You're a quick steady. Back at the ranch, Ezra taught her to split kindling, positioning her hands on the axe handle. Keep your stance wide, he instructed. Let the weight of the axe do the work. Clara's first few swings went wild, but by afternoon, neat piles of kindling lined the woodshed wall. The evenings brought welcome rest. They sat in the warm kitchen, lamp light casting soft shadows as Clara mended tears in work shirts. She told stories of her childhood in Missouri, learning to make preserves with her mother, helping her father in their small general store. We never had much, she said one evening, threading her needle, but Mama could stretch $1 further than anyone. Made me learn to. She smiled at the memory. Said a thrifty woman was worth her weight in gold. Ezra listened quietly, whittling a new handle for a broken tool. The comfortable silence between them grew familiar, broken only by the crack of the fire and the whisper of thread through fabric. One afternoon, hoofbeats in the yard announced the arrival of Maggie's buggy. She hurried inside, waving an official-looking envelope. This came for you at the post office, Clara. Territorial judge's seal. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she opened the letter. Ezra and Maggie watched her face as she read, her expression tightening. They've acknowledged my claim, she said finally, looking up. But I have to prove continuous improvement by spring. Buildings maintained, livestock healthy, crops planned. She set the letter down carefully. If I can't show I'm working the land properly, they'll invalidate my homestead rights. Spring, Ezra muttered, calculating. That's not much time, with winter coming. We'll need to check your uncle's cabin soon, Clara said, determination replacing worry in her voice. See what repairs it needs before the snow. Maggie nodded briskly. I'll start asking around town about supplies. Martha Wilson's boy works. At the lumber yard, he might give us fair prices if I mention his mama's quilting circle. I can help with repairs, Ezra offered. Show you what to watch for with the stock, too. Cattle get ornery in winter, need to know the signs when they're ailing. Clara smoothed the letter with careful fingers. I'm grateful, truly, but I can't ask you both to do so much. You ain't ask me, Ezra cut in gruffly. Just doing what? Needs doing? That's right, Maggie agreed, already making lists on a scrap of paper. Now you'll need roof patches, certainly. Window glass, probably. Stovepipe. They spent the evening planning, the letter lying between them on the kitchen. Table like a challenge? Clara took notes in her neat hand, adding figures carefully. The task ahead was daunting, but she felt stronger knowing she wasn't facing it alone. The next morning, Ezra took Clara to check on a group of cattle in the north pasture. He pointed out signs she needed to learn, how they moved, how they held their heads, which behaviors might indicate sickness. Watch that one, he said, indicating a red heifer. See how she's standing. Might be foot rot starting. Need to catch it early out here. Clara studied the animal intently, committing every detail to memory. Each piece of knowledge might make the difference in proving she could manage her uncle's land. That evening, as usual, they returned to the warmth of the kitchen. Clara worked on dinner while Ezra cleaned his tack. The familiar scent of leather and saddle soap mingled with stewing beef and vegetables. My uncle must have loved this land something fierce, Clara said softly, stirring the pot. To come out here alone, start from nothing. She glanced at the judge's letter, still on the table. I owe it to him to try just as hard. Ezra looked up from his work, studying her face in the fading light. The quiet strength he saw there reminded him of the countless other pioneers who'd fought to make homes in this unforgiving country. None of them had succeeded entirely alone. Well, he said, returning to his task, reckon we'd best get started then. Winter won't wait on us. Clara smiled, understanding all he left unsaid. Tomorrow would bring more lessons, more work, more challenges to face. But for now, the kitchen was warm, the stew was bubbling, and hope felt as solid as the walls around them. The wagon wheels creaked under their heavy load as Ezra and Clara set out at first light. Tools rattled against wooden boards in the bed, and sacks of feed shifted with each bump in the rutted track. Clara sat beside Ezra on the wagon seat, his spare coat pulled tight against the morning chill. Uncle James wrote that the cabin needed work, Clara said, clutching a worn letter. But he said the creek made it worth every splinter and callus. Ezra nodded, keeping the horses steady through. A rough patch. The journey stretched through the morning and into afternoon, the sun climbing high over the autumn-brown plains. They passed scattered homesteads and grazing cattle, the land growing more rugged as they followed the creek's winding course. There, Clara pointed to suddenly, sitting straighter. Behind those cottonwoods, the cabin emerged from the shelter. The trees, its weather-grayed walls still standing square despite years of neglect. The porch had collapsed on one side, its support posts rotted through. Shutters hung askew or lay broken on the ground, and tall grass grew right up to the door. Ezra pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard. Structure looked sound enough. Good bones. Clara was already climbing down, her boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. She walked slowly around the cabin, trailing her fingers along the rough logs. When she reached the creek bank, she stood watching the water flow, clear and steady over worn stones. Uncle James was right, she said, when Ezra joined her. The water alone makes this place precious. She gestured to the gentle slope leading down to the creek. Good drainage for gardens. Enough flat ground for corrals. They made camp inside the cabin as evening approached. Clara swept decades of leaves from the stone hearth while Ezra stacked firewood. Soon a cheerful blaze pushed back the shadows, revealing walls that needed chinking and a floor thick with dried mud. Their supper was simple. Beans and bacon cooked over the open fire, with coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. They ate from tin plates, sitting on their bedrolls spread near the hearth. First meal in your home, Ezra said, pouring more coffee. Clara looked around the bare room, imagination painting what could be. It will be with work, lots of work. Night settled deeper on the cabin. Ezra spread his bedroll near the door, rifle within easy reach. Clara lay wrapped in blankets by the dying fire, but sleep came slowly to them both. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind through the gaps, kept them alert for unwelcome visitors. Dawn broke cold and clear. They were up with first light, eager to begin. Ezra attacked the collapsed porch, pulling rotted boards free and setting new support posts. The sound of his axe rang through the morning as he shaped fresh timber. Inside, Clara scraped at years of caked mud on the floor, working on hands and knees with determination. She sorted through broken furniture, setting aside pieces that could be mended. A wooden rocker missing only its seat. A table with one sturdy leg. Each salvaged item felt like reclaiming a piece of her uncle's life. Mid-morning brought the clip-clop of hooves. Ezra straightened from his work, hand moving toward his rifle, but it was only a neighbor. The man reined his horse to a stop at the edge of the yard. "Morning," he called, touching his hat brim. "Saw smoke from your chimney. Thought I'd check who was about." "Much obliged," Ezra replied carefully. Clara Lee's working her uncle's claim here. The writer's expression grew serious. "James Lee's place? Better watch yourself, ma'am. That banker Ames has been buying up land all along the creek. Offering cash first, then finding ways to pressure folks who won't sell." Clara stepped out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. "This is my home now. I don't aim to sell." The neighbor nodded slowly. "Just thought you should know. He's gotten 3 parcels upstream already. Makes folks nervous, him controlling so much water." He gathered his reins. "Good luck to you both. We need more honest folk holding ground out here." They watched him ride away, the warning settling heavy in the morning air. Clara's jaw set in a determined line as she turned back to her work. Ezra studied her profile for a moment, then resumed setting porch posts with renewed purpose. The day wore on, full of small victories. Each clean floorboard, each properly set post felt like a step toward making the cabin truly Clara's. By late afternoon, the new porch took shape, solid and level. Inside, the main room emerged from years of neglect. Ready for proper furnishing, Clara stood in the doorway as evening approached, watching the creek catch the lost sunlight. "It's a good piece of land," she said quietly. "Worth fighting for." Ezra drove the last nail into a porch board before answering. "Ames won't make it easy." "No," Clara agreed, "but neither will we." The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Clara emerged from the cabin to find Ezra already splitting logs for repairs, his breath steaming in the cold air. She paused to watch his steady rhythm, the arc of the axe, the sharp crack of wood, the neat stack growing beside him. "Best get water while the creek ain't frozen," he called without looking up. Clara nodded, gathering the buckets. Her muscles protested after yesterday's work, but she straightened her shoulders and headed down the slope. The water ran clear and cold over her hands as she filled the buckets. 4 days of steady work had worn paths between cabin and creek, between woodpile and garden plot. Each trip made the land feel more like home. Back at the cabin, she found Ezra examining the roof. "Them shingles won't last winter," he said, pointing to a weathered section. "Need fresh thatch before snow comes." Clara shaded her eyes, studying the problem. "Show me how." He looked at her doubtfully. "Roof work ain't exactly. If I'm to manage alone, I need to learn it all," she interrupted. "Even the hard parts." Ezra's expression softened slightly. "Reckon that's true enough." He showed her how to gather and bundle the long grass that grew in patches near the creek. Together they sorted stalks by length, tied them into neat bundles, and carried them to where the old ladder leaned against the cabin wall. "Watch your footing," he cautioned as Clara followed him up. The roof pitched gently, but the height still made her breath catch. Ezra demonstrated how to layer the thatch, working from bottom to top so water would shed properly. "Like this?" Clara asked, carefully placing a bundle. "Better secure it tighter," he advised. "Winter storms'll test every." A loose board shifted under his foot and he stumbled. The board slid free and tumbled end over end, landing with a splash in the creek below. Clara's startled laugh rang out across the yard. "Well, that's one way to test if wood floats." Ezra's weather-worn face cracked into a reluctant smile. "Reckon I deserve that." He climbed down to fish out the errant board, while Clara continued laying thatch, her confidence growing with each row. They worked through the morning and into afternoon, stopping only for a quick meal of bread and dried beef. Clara's hands grew sore from the rough grass, but satisfaction warmed her more than the autumn sun. By late afternoon, the worst section of roof was properly thatched up. The clip-clop of hooves announced Maggie's arrival just before sunset. She drove her buggy into the yard, the back loaded with supplies. "Land sakes, you two have been busy," she exclaimed, taking in the new porch and repaired roof. "Clara, you're looking more like a proper rancher every day." Clara laughed, brushing straw from her skirts. "I must look a proper mess, you mean?" "Honest work leaves honest marks," Maggie replied, reaching into the buggy. "Here, fresh bread from my oven, and a letter from Reverend Thompson." They gathered around the hearth while Clara read the letter aloud. The preacher offered prayers for her success and promised the church ladies would help with spring planting. Says here they're already setting aside seed. She finished, touched by the show of support. "Cowan's taking notice," Maggie observed. "Folk respect someone willing to work hard." She shot a meaningful glance at her brother, but Ezra was focused on building up the fire. The first snowflakes began drifting down as evening deepened. Maggie declined to stay, not wanting to drive home in darkness. After she left, Clara and Ezra sat in comfortable silence by the fire, watching flames dance against the gathering dark. "Thank you," Clara said softly, "for teaching me things I never thought I could learn. Milking, mending, even thatching a roof. It all seemed impossible a month ago. Ezra stirred the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. You're a quick study. Got more grit than most. Still, you didn't have to help. Especially not after finding me uninvited in your barn that morning. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Reckon Blossom chose for me. She always did like an audience for milking. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter as wind whistled through the cabin's remaining gaps. Does the silence ever get too heavy? She asked carefully. Out here alone? Ezra was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He used to play fiddle evenings. He said finally, haven't touched it since Sarah. Since my wife passed. I'd love to hear it sometime, Clara said gently. Ezra stood abruptly, moving to add another log to the fire. Need to check the horses before snow gets deeper, he said, voice gruff. But Clara caught the flash of emotion in his eyes before he turned away. She watched him through the window as he crossed the snowy yard to the lean-to, where they'd sheltered the horses. His broad shoulders were set against more than just the weather. Carrying the weight of grief still fresh after 17 years, the snow fell steadier now, dusting the new porch and softening the hard edges of the cabin's repairs. Clara touched. The window glass cool beneath her fingers. Outside, Ezra's dark figure moved between the horses, his gentle murmurs carrying faintly through the growing storm. The snow fell heavier with each passing hour, blanketing the homestead in thick white drifts. Ezra stood at the cabin window, frowning at the darkening sky. Storm settling in proper now. We'd best head back to the ranch while we can still see the track. Clara looked up from where she was organizing supplies. But there's still so much to do here? Cav on the keep, Ezra said firmly. No sense getting trapped out here with winter coming on. He helped her secure the shutters and load essential tools into the wagon while the horses stamped impatiently in the thickening snow. The journey back took twice as long as usual, with Ezra carefully guiding the team through fresh drifts. Clara huddled beside him, grateful for the warmth of his spare coat. By the time they reached his ranch, the storm had turned the familiar landscape strange and white. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Clara headed to the barn early, her boots crunching through fresh snow. Inside, Blossom greeted her with a gentle low, no longer the suspicious glare of weeks past. Clara settled onto the milking stool, speaking softly as she worked. Look at yous now, old girl, she murmured, hands moving in steady rhythm. Who'd have thought we'd end up friends? The cow switched her tail in what Clara chose to take. As agreement, Ezra found him there a few minutes later. He paused in the doorway, watching Clara work with quiet competence. Reckon she's finally decided you'll do, he said, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. High praise indeed, Clara laughed, finishing the last streams of milk. Elle? I suspect she still prefers you. Sunday morning brought a brief respite from the cold. Clara smoothed her best dress, freshly pressed despite its worn edges, and waited by the wagon while Ezra hitched up the team. The thought of facing the whole town at once made her stomach flutter, but she straightened her shoulders. She had earned her place here. They rode to church in comfortable silence, the wagon wheels leaving twin tracks in the melting snow. As they approached the white-painted building, Clara noticed heads turning, whispers spreading through the gathering. Proud. Ezra helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady beneath her elbow. The whispers grew as they walked up the church steps side by side. Clara caught fragments. McKenna's finally ... double quotes and ... that widow from ... that held her head high. Inside, Maggie waved them to her pew, beaming like she'd just won a prize at the county fair. Reverend Thompson's sermon touched on perseverance and community, with several pointed looks their direction. After the final hymn, he made his way through the crowd to greet them. Miss Lee, he said warmly, clasping her hand. We're so pleased to have you joining us. I've been meaning to speak with you about your situation. That's very kind of you, Reverend, Clara replied. Not at all. I knew your uncle, good man, salt of the earth. I'd be happy to write to Judge Harrison about your claim. He and I served together in the war. I'd be most grateful, Clara said, relief washing through her. A letter from the Reverend could carry significant weight. As they left the church, Victor Ames stood waiting by the hitching post, elegant in his dark suit. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he touched the brim of his hat. "McKenna," he said smoothly, "getting awful involved in matters that don't concern you, aren't you?" Ezra's jaw tightened. "Miss Lee's claim is legitimate. You know that?" "Come." "Now," Ames said, voice dripping false sympathy. "Sentiment won't change the law. That creek water is too valuable for—" He glanced at Clara dismissively. Amateur farming experiments. "The law's on my side, Mr. Ames," Clara cut in, meeting his gaze steadily. "As is the truth." Ames's smile turned cold. "We'll see about that." He turned to go, then paused. "Word of advice, McKenna, back the winning horse while you can." They watched him stride away, boots clicking on the wooden sidewalk. Clara's hands were trembling slightly, but her voice was firm. "He doesn't frighten me." "No," Ezra agreed quietly. "Reckon he doesn't?" Back at the ranch that evening, Maggie insisted on staying to cook Sunday supper. She hummed as she worked, shooting knowing looks between her brother and Clara while she rolled out biscuits. My, she said innocently. "Quite a stir at church today. Half the ladies nearly fell off their pews when you two walked in together." Ezra grunted, not looking up from cleaning his boots. "And did you see Mrs. Peterson clutching her pearls?" Maggie continued, clearly enjoying herself. "Though I must say, brother, you clean up nice when you make the effort." "Almost remembered how to use a comb." Maggie ... double quotes, Ezra warned. "What?" "Can a sister take pride in seeing her brother escorting a fine lady to church?" Clara bent her head over the potatoes she was peeling, hiding her smile as color crept up Ezra's neck. The kitchen was warm and bright, filled with good smells, and the comfortable bickering of siblings. For the first time in years, she felt truly at home. Later, after Maggie had left and the dishes were dried, Clara stood at the kitchen window watching stars appear in the crystal clear sky. The day's events turned in her mind: the welcome at church, Ames's threats, the way Ezra had stood solid beside her through it all. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Ezra's quiet voice came from behind her. "Just thinking how different everything is from that first morning in your barn," she said. "I was so desperate then, but now ... She turned to face him. "Now I have friends. Allies. A real chance to make this work." Ezra nodded slowly. "Whole town's coming around to your side. Ames won't find it so easy to push you out." "Thanks to you," Claire said softly. He shifted uncomfortably. "Just doing what's right." The clock struck 9, its chime filling the comfortable silence between them. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the snow-covered plains, and somewhere in the barn, Blossom lowed softly in response to the night sounds of the ranch. December swept across the plains like a cruel broom, pushing away the last hints of autumn and replacing them with bitter winds that cut straight through to the bone. Frost painted delicate patterns on the barn windows each morning. Growing thicker with each passing day, Clara pulled her borrowed coat tighter as she helped Ezra inventory supplies for the upcoming cattle drive to the railhead. The shipping day was crucial for every rancher in the territory, their main chance to turn months of hard work into actual profit. 8 days' worth of beans, she counted, marking the supplies in her neat hand. Coffee, flour, salt pork, ... She looked up at Ezra. "How many men are you taking?" 6 drovers, he answered, checking the leather on a stack of harnesses. "Good hands, all of them, though none as particular about provisions as your being." Clara smiled, continuing her list. "Someone has to make sure you all eat properly. These temperatures demand hot meals." The next morning dawned gray and sharp with cold. Clara rose before sunrise to help pack the chuck wagon, her breath visible in the lantern light. She'd spent the previous evening baking extra bread and packing it carefully to stay fresh. The drovers began arriving as the sky lightened, stamping, their boots against the cold and greeting Ezra with quiet respect. "Miss Lee, One older drover touched his hat as she handed him a cup of hot coffee. I heard you might be riding out with us partway. Just to deliver lunch, she clarified. Though I admit I'm curious to see how it all works. Ezra appeared in the doorway. Time to move out. Cattle won't drive themselves. The morning was a flurry of activity as the men got the herd moving. Clara marveled at how smoothly they worked, together keeping the nervous cattle in formation as they headed toward the railroad. She mounted her horse mid-morning, following at a safe distance with the lunch provisions secured in her saddlebags. The winter landscape stretched vast and empty around them, broken only by the dark line of cattle and riders ahead. Around noon, she caught up with the drive at a natural stopping point near a sheltered draw. The men dismounted gratefully, gathering around as she distributed bread, cheese, and hot coffee from her thermoses. Sure appreciate this, Miss Lee, one young drover said between bites. Boss usually just has us eating cold biscuits on the move. Ezra raised an eyebrow. Never heard you complain before, Tom. Never knew what we were missing, boss. Clara watched. The easy camaraderie between the men, the way they deferred to Ezra without fear. He had earned their loyalty through competence and fair treatment, something she'd learned herself over the past weeks. After lunch, she rode with them as far as the rail yard, where the scene took her breath away. Dozens of cattle cars stretched along the tracks while crews worked to load bellowing steers into them. Merchants had set up temporary stalls nearby, selling everything from rope to winter boots to the gathered ranchers and drovers. A whole territory depends on days like this, Ezra explained as they watched. Cattle drives the heartbeat of everything else. Clara nodded, understanding better now why Ames was so determined to control the water rights. Whoever controlled the rancher's water could control the entire cattle trade. As his men began the complex process of loading the cattle, Ezra touched her elbow. Got an errand at the mercantile. Care to join me? Inside the store, Clara breathed in the familiar smells of leather, coffee, and dried goods. While Ezra spoke with the proprietor about an order, she found herself drawn to a display of winter goods. A soft wool scarf in deep blue caught her eye, but she turned away quickly at the price tag. A few minutes later, Ezra completed his business, and they stepped back into the cold afternoon air. He handed her a brown paper package. What's this? She asked, surprised. Just practical, he said gruffly. Can't have you freezing on the ride home. Inside was the blue scarf she'd been admiring. Clara ran her fingers over the soft wool, touched by his thoughtfulness. Thank you, she said softly. It's beautiful. He helped her wrap it around her neck, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. Their eyes met briefly before he looked away, clearing his throat. Best get you headed back before dark. The ride home was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts as the winter sun sank toward the horizon. Back at the ranch, Clara insisted on making supper while Ezra tended to their horses. The kitchen was warm and bright when he came in, filled with the smell of simmering stew. They sat down together, the familiar routine of sharing a meal somehow different tonight. I never properly thanked you, Clara said after a while, for all you've taught me these past weeks. No need, Ezra replied. You're a quick study. Still, she stirred her stew thoughtfully. When my husband Thomas fell ill, I learned to be self-sufficient out of necessity. But this learning the cattle business, feeling capable, that's different. Ezra set down his spoon, giving her his full attention as she continued. The consumption took him so slowly, she said softly. Some days he seemed almost well. Then the coughing would start again. I prayed so hard for healing, but ... double quotes. She took a deep breath. In the end, my prayers changed. I asked for strength. Instead, the Lord provided that, at least. Ezra sat in uncharacteristic silence, his face shadowed with understanding. Finally, he spoke quietly. Fate's a funny thing. Sometimes it's all that carries us through. Clara nodded, remembering countless nights spent in prayer beside Thomas's sickbed. It was my anchor when everything else seemed to be slipping away. My Sarah, Ezra said suddenly, surprising them both. She loved to sing hymns. Had a voice, like an angel. He stopped, as if the words had escaped without permission. Clara waited, sensing the rarity of this moment. When he didn't continue, she simply said, "I'd love to hear about her sometime, when you're ready." He nodded once, gratitude flickering in his eyes. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, while outside the winter wind sang its lonely song across the plains. The soft glow of the lamp cast their shadows on the wall, no longer just a suspicious rancher and a desperate widow, but two people who had begun to see each other clearly, with all their strengths and scars laid bare. Christmas. Eve painted the Colorado landscape in crystalline white. Clara spent the morning helping Ezra and Maggie transform the barn into a welcoming gathering space for the evening social. They swept the wooden floors clean and hung oil lanterns from the rafters, their golden light reflecting off the fresh straw. "Looks almost fancy enough for dancing," Maggie said, adjusting a red ribbon she'd tied to one of the posts. Clara stepped back to admire their work. "I never thought a barn could look so festive." She breathed in the familiar sense of hay and leather now mingled with pine boughs they'd gathered from the nearby hills. Ezra worked quietly, moving bales to create seating around the edges. His movements were precise as always, but Clara noticed a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there that morning by late afternoon. Savory smells began drifting from the kitchen where neighborhood women were gathering with their contributions. Clara had spent the previous day baking her mother's apple pie recipe, the crust delicately woven in a lattice pattern just as she'd been taught Dot as dusk approached. Wagon after wagon arrived, carrying families from miles around. Children darted between adults' legs while their parents stamped snow from their boots and called out greetings. The barn filled with the hum of conversation and laughter. "Sure is good to see Ezra hosting again," Clara overheard one older rancher say to his wife. "Place hasn't seen a proper gathering since Sarah passed." Clara watched Ezra move among his guests, his usual reserve softened by the spirit of the evening. He'd put on a clean shirt and combed his hair, though he still looked more comfortable tending to practical matters than making small talk. Maggie appeared at Clara's elbow with 2 cups of hot cider. "Here," she said, pressing one into Clara's hands. "You've been so busy making sure everyone else is taken care of, you haven't had a bite yourself. Thank you." Clara sipped the warm drink gratefully. "I'd almost forgotten what it feels like to be part of a real Christmas celebration." "It's been a while for all of us," Maggie agreed, her eyes finding her brother across the room, especially him. The evening progressed with shared dishes and stories. Children played hide-and-seek between the hay bales while their parents caught up on news and weather predictions. The preacher led everyone in singing carols, their voices rising to the rafters in joyful harmony. During a lull in the festivities, Clara approached Ezra, who had retreated to a quiet corner. "Would you play for us?" she asked softly. "Your fiddle? I mean, everyone would love to hear it." Ezra's face tightened. "Been years," he said gruffly. "Might not remember how." "Some things," Clara said. "The heart doesn't forget." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Wait here." Clara watched him stride toward the house, his broad shoulders squared as if facing a challenge. When he returned carrying his fiddle case, a hushed anticipation fell over the gathering. Ezra took his time removing the instrument, his weathered hands gentle on the polished wood. He drew the bow across the strings once, adjusting the tuning, with careful attention. Then, without preamble, he launched into a lively reel that had feet tapping within seconds. The music filled the barn with warmth and motion. Couples began to dance, their boots striking the wooden floor in time with the melody. Children twirled and laughed, caught up in the infectious rhythm. Clara watched Ezra's face transform as he played, years falling away with each note. When the reel ended, applause erupted through the barn. Ezra acknowledged it with a slight nod, then closed his eyes. The next piece began softer, a hymn that Clara recognized but had never heard played with such depth of feeling. The conversation stilled as the gentle tune wove through the air. This was Sarah's favorite, Maggie whispered beside her. She used to sing it while working in her garden. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched Ezra sway slightly. With the music lost in memories, the piece spoke of love and loss, of faith tested and renewed. When the last note faded, there was a moment of profound silence before the quiet murmur of conversation resumed. Ezra carefully returned the fiddle to its case. Clara approached him, noting the mixture of peace and vulnerability in his expression. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your music is truly a blessing." "Wasn't sure I could still play," he admitted, "but something about tonight ... He gestured at the gathering, the lantern light, the contentment on familiar faces. Felt right. As the evening drew to a close, families began loading into their wagons for the cold ride home. Clara helped clean up while Ezra saw off the last of their guests. Finally, only the three of them remained: Ezra, Clara, and Maggie, who insisted on staying to finish putting the barn in order. "You two go on," Maggie said, shooing them toward the house. "I'll bank the lanterns and be along in a minute." Outside, the night sky stretched vast and clear above them, stars sharp as diamonds in the winter air. Their boots crunched in the fresh snow as they walked toward the house. Clara glanced at Ezra, noting how the tension had eased from his bearing. "I haven't seen stars like this since leaving Missouri," Clara said, tilting her head back to admire the view. "Sky seems bigger out here," Ezra agreed. "More room for light to shine through." They paused at the porch steps, neither quite ready to go inside. The peaceful quiet of the winter night wrapped around them like a blanket, broken only by the distant cry of a coyote and the soft creak of the barn door as Maggie finished her tasks. "Thank you for sharing your music tonight," Claire said. "I know it wasn't easy." Ezra was quiet for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air. "Reckon some things are worth the doing, even when they're hard." He looked at her, then his expression opened in a way she'd never seen before. "Been a good Christmas Eve?" Clara nodded, understanding all that lay beneath those simple words. Together they stood in companionable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, while behind them, the warm lights of home beckoned them in from the winter night. Christmas morning dawned crisp and bright, the fresh snow glittering like diamond dust in the early light. Clara stood at Ezra's kitchen window, watching the sun paint golden streaks across the pristine white landscape. The warmth from last night's gathering still lingered in her heart, making the morning feel especially peaceful. Ezra moved quietly behind her, stoking the stove and setting coffee to boil. Neither spoke much, comfortable in the morning stillness. The familiar scent of coffee began to fill the kitchen just as Maggie's buggy appeared on the road. Right on time for Christmas breakfast. The sharp rap at the door startled them all. Deputy Nash stood on the porch, his breath clouding in the cold air. Snow clung to his boots, and his official manner seemed at odds with the holiday morning. "Miss Lee," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mr. McKenna," he pulled an envelope from his coat. "Got some official business here." Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she took the envelope. The paper was thick, official-looking, with the county seal visible in the corner. As she read, the color drained from her face. "This can't be right," she whispered. Ezra stepped closer, his shadow falling across the paper. "What is it?" "An eviction notice." Clara's voice cracked. "Mr. Ames claims I've abandoned the homestead. Says my extended stay here invalidates my claim." She looked up at Deputy Nash. "He can't do this. The judge gave me until spring." Nash shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Ames filed the complaint yesterday. Says you haven't maintained continuous residence, as required by homestead law. You're ordered to vacate the property before New Year's Day." "On Christmas morning?" Maggie burst out. "Victor Ames hasn't a Christian bone in his body." Ezra's expression darkened. "This isn't legal. Clara's been improving the property. We've got witnesses." "Take it up with the judge," Nash said, already backing toward his horse. "I'm just delivering the notice." After Nash rode away, Clara sank into a kitchen chair, the paper crumpling in her grip. "Everything we've done, all the repairs. It doesn't matter if he can prove I abandoned the claim." "You haven't abandoned anything," Ezra said firmly. "You've been learning necessary skills. We'll fight this." A commotion outside drew their attention. One of Ezra's ranch hands was running toward the house, waving urgently. "Mr. McKenna, the milk cow's gone missing." They hurried to the corral. Blossom's stall stood empty, her water bucket overturned. Ezra examined the halter he found lying in the snow, its leather cleanly cut. This was no accident, he said grimly. Someone took her in the night. Clara pressed her hands to her mouth. Who would steal a milk cow on Christmas? Someone trying to make sure you can't provide for yourself. Maggie said darkly, without Blossom, you'll have no milk or butter to sell. Ezra's jaw tightened, his expression dangerous. Stealing livestock is a hanging offense. This is more than legal games now. They spent the next hour searching. Ezra and two ranch hands rode out in different directions, while Clara and Maggie checked closer to home. The wind had blown most of the night, filling in any tracks with fresh snow. The temperature dropped steadily as clouds rolled in, threatening more weather dot by late afternoon. Everyone returned empty-handed. Ezra's face was wind-burned, his clothes covered in snow from checking ravines and thickets. He'd found nothing, no tracks, no broken branches, no sign of where Blossom might have been driven. They gathered in the kitchen, where Maggie poured hot coffee for everyone. The Christmas dinner she'd brought sat forgotten, growing cold on the sideboard. Clara stared into her coffee cup, her shoulders slumped with worry. What am I going to do? She asked quietly. Even if we found Blossom, the eviction notice ... We'll petition the judge, Maggie said. Explain about the improvements you've made. Surely he'll see reason. Ames has friends in the courthouse, Ezra reminded them. And Clara's right. Staying here might have given him the leverage he needed. I had nowhere else to go, Clara whispered. No experience with ranch work. You were teaching me what I needed to know. As evening drew in, Maggie reluctantly departed, for home, promising to return the next day. Clara stood at the window, watching the sun set behind heavy clouds. The joy of last night's gathering felt very far away. Lord, she prayed aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. I need your strength now. Show me the way forward. Help me stand firm against this trial. Ezra, sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle, paused in his work. He watched Clara's reflection. In the window glass, saw the steel in her spine despite her gentle words. Something fierce and protective stirred in his chest. Without speaking, he made a silent vow. He would not let Ames destroy what Clara had worked so hard to build. The snow began falling again as darkness settled over the ranch. Tomorrow they would start fighting back. But tonight, on this stolen Christmas, they could only watch the white flakes swirl past the windows and pray for guidance through the storm ahead. The morning after, Christmas broke steel gray and bitter. Frost traced delicate patterns on Ezra's wagon windows as he hitched up his team before dawn. Clara emerged from the house wrapped in her warmest shawl, her face set with determination. They had barely spoken over breakfast, both knowing the confrontation that lay ahead. Maggie met them at the crossroads, her buggy already pointed toward town. The three vehicles made a small procession down the rutted road, wheels crunching through. Day old snow. Clara sat straight back beside Ezra, her hands clenched in her lap. We'll start at the bank, Ezra said, breaking the long silence. Make him face us directly. The town was quiet, most businesses still closed for the holiday. Smoke rose from chimneys in lazy spirals, and a few early risers hurried along the boardwalks. They tied up outside the bank's impressive brick facade. Asterisk, the guard at the door blocked their path. Mr. Ames isn't receiving visitors today. Tell him Ezra McKenna needs to speak with him, Ezra growled. About stolen property. The guard disappeared. Inside, but returned moments later. Mr. Ames is in meetings all day. Says to take any concerns to his lawyer. Clara stepped forward. Tell him Mrs. Clara Lee is here about her eviction notice. I have a right to face my accuser. But the guard merely shook his head, unmoved by her quiet dignity. Maggie touched Clara's arm. Come on, we'll try the preacher next. He knows everyone's business in this town. They found Reverend Thompson in his study behind the church, already at work despite the early hour. The small room smelled of lamp oil and old books. He listened gravely as they explained the situation. This is serious business, he said, removing his spectacles to polish them. Ames has been systematically buying up water rights all along. The creek, your uncle's land is the last piece he needs to control the whole watershed. But what can we do? Claire asked. He's using my stay at Ezra's against me. The preacher leaned forward. Gather witnesses? Everyone who's seen you working. To improve that homestead. Document everything. Repairs, livestock, preparations for spring planting. The law requires continuous improvement, not continuous residence. We'll build a case the judge can't ignore. As they left the church, one of Ezra's ranch hands, young Tommy Weber, came running up the street. Mr. McKenna. He called out slightly. Out of breath. Been looking all over for you. Got something to tell you about that missing cow. They huddled in the shelter of the church porch as Tommy spoke in low tones. Night before last, I was riding fence line late. Saw 3 men herding a cow toward Ames's barn. Too dark to be sure, but looked like Blossom to me. They was being real quiet about it, too. Ezra's expression hardened. You're certain it was Ames's barn? Tommy nodded vigorously. Yes, sir. Recognized 2 of the men, too. Both work for him. That's theft, Maggie said fiercely. We can use this. Better then. That, Ezra replied. We can force a confrontation. Make him answer publicly where everyone can hear. Dark clouds were gathering as they discussed their plan. The wind picked up, carrying the sharp scent of approaching snow. By mid-afternoon, fat flakes were falling steadily. Storm's coming in fast, Ezra observed grimly. We won't make it back to the ranch before dark. You'll both stay with me, Maggie declared. My house is small, but it's warm. They hurried through the thickening snow to Maggie's neat little home on the edge of town. She soon had a fire blazing and kettle steaming. The storm howled outside, but inside was snug and warmed out as evening settled in. Maggie served tea and leftover Christmas bread. Clara sat close to the fire, her hands wrapped around her cup. The flames cast flickering shadows on her face, highlighting the worry in her eyes. What if we can't prove anything? She said softly, what if Ames wins? He won't, Ezra said firmly. We've got witnesses now. Clara shook her head. It's not just the land I'm afraid of losing. Her voice caught slightly. These past weeks, I've found something I thought was gone forever, a place where I belong. People who ... She trailed off, staring into her tea. Maggie reached over and squeezed her hand. You belong here now, Clara Lee. Land or no land. Ezra said nothing, but his expression softened as he watched Clara across the firelit room. The wind rattled the windows, but inside Maggie's house, they were sheltered together, planning their stand against the storm that threatened more than just a piece of land. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 8 bells, its chimes nearly lost in the howling wind. Tomorrow they would face Ames with their evidence. Tonight they drew strength from each other's company. 3 people bound together by more than just a legal fight. Clara set down her empty cup and moved to help. Maggie cleared the table. Thank you, she said quietly. Both of you. I couldn't face this alone. You don't have to, Ezra replied, his deep voice gentle. Not anymore. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Maggie's warm kitchen, Clara felt the truth of those words settle deep in her heart. Whatever came next, she was no longer alone. The winter dawn painted the sky in pale streaks as 3 riders approached. Town. Ezra led the way, his broad shoulders set with purpose. Clara rode beside him, her borrowed coat pulled tight against the morning chill. Maggie followed on her steady mare, prayer book clutched beneath her cloak. They found Reverend Thompson, waiting at the church steps with Tommy Weber, the young ranch hand shifting from foot to foot in the cold. As they dismounted, other townspeople began emerging from shops and homes, drawn by the unusual early gathering. Lead the way, Tommy, Ezra said, his voice carrying in the crisp air. The small group followed the ranch hand toward Ames's impressive red barn at the edge of town. More curious onlookers fell in behind them. Boots crunching on fresh snow, Ezra strode to the barn's heavy double doors and pounded with his fist. The sound echoed like thunder. Ames, show yourself. Minutes passed. The crowd grew, their whispers rising like wind through prairie grass. Finally, the door to Ames's house opened, and the banker emerged, hastily adjusting his coat collar. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" Ames demanded, his usual smooth manner cracking. "Open your barn," Ezra commanded. "Now, this is private property," Ames blustered, looking nervously at the gathering crowd. "I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Clara stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "You stole my cow, Mr. Ames. We have a witness who saw your men leading her here 2 nights ago." Tommy raised his hand. "Saw it plain as day, sir." 3. Men leading a cow matching Blossom's description right into this here barn. The preacher cleared his throat. "Best open those doors, Victor. Let's settle this properly." Ames's face reddened as he looked at the stern faces surrounding him. With trembling hands, he unlatched the barn door. It swung open with a protesting creak. There, in the dim light, stood Blossom. The cow lifted her head at the sudden brightness, her familiar bell tinkling softly. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "That's my cow," Clara said firmly. "The one you claimed I abandoned." "Abandoned stock," Ames sputtered, backing away. "No proper documentation." "The law clearly states, speaking of documentation," Ezra interrupted, reaching into his coat. He withdrew a weathered envelope, yellowed with age. "Found something interesting in my late wife's papers last night." The preacher stepped closer as Ezra carefully unfolded the document inside. "This here's the original survey deed," Ezra explained, his voice carrying to the gathered crowd. "My wife's father was the territorial surveyor. He kept copies of everything he filed." Reverend Thompson adjusted his spectacles, examining the paper carefully. "This appears to be properly notarized," he announced. "Shows clear title to the creek property, passing from original survey through Claire's uncle, with all water rights intact." "Let me see that." Ames lunged for the paper, but Ezra held it out of reach. "No need," the preacher said firmly. "As an officer of the church and witness to legal matters, I verify this deed as valid and binding." He turned to address the crowd. "Let all gathered here bear witness to this truth." The townsfolk nodded, their faces stern. Several men moved to untie Blossom, leading her out into the morning light. The cow went straight to Clara, pushing her broad head against her mistress's shoulder. Ames stood alone in his doorway, his carefully constructed scheme crumbling before his eyes. The crowd's silence carried more weight than any shouted accusation. The March sun warmed the still chilly morning air as Ezra guided his wagon along the familiar trail to Clara's homestead. The creek rushed beside the path, swollen with snowmelt, its waters crystal clear in the early light. Winter's grip had finally loosened, leaving behind a landscape ready for spring's touch dot as he crested the last rise. Ezra's chest tightened at the sight before him. The cabin stood proud against the blue sky, its fresh-cut shingles and new shutters a testament to months of shared labor. The porch boards no longer sagged, and smoke curled cheerfully from the sturdy chimney. Around back, the garden fence waited. For tender shoots, its posts set deep and true. Blossom lifted her head from the fresh grass, her bell chiming softly as she watched the wagon approach. The cow had grown plump over the winter, proving Clara's growing skill with livestock. She looked a far sight better than that first morning in his barn, when a determined widow had demanded milking lessons. Clara emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. Her smile brightened as Ezra began unloading the supplies, seeds for planting, a new milk pail, some sturdy tools. She moved to help, their hands brushing as they worked together with familiar ease. When the wagon was empty, Ezra cleared his throat, suddenly finding his boots mighty interesting. "Reckon you've learned just about everything about running stock," he said gruffly. "But maybe ... He shifted his weight, fingers worrying the brim of his hat. "Maybe you might still need some help with the milking and other things." Clara's eye sparkled as she looked up at him. "I suppose I might," she said softly. "Though Blossom's gotten quite cooperative these days." "That's so." Ezra's voice grew gentle. "Well, offer stands all the same." "I accept," Clara answered, her smile warm as spring sunshine. Later that morning, they rode side by side into town, their horses falling into easy step together. The church bells rang across the valley, calling the faithful to worship. Ezra gazed at the woman beside him, marveling at how the Lord worked in mysterious ways, through stubborn cattle and determined women, through shared labor and quiet moments. His heart, so long closed, had found its second chance at love. As sure as winter yielded to spring dot, if today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here where love speaks softly and stays.